My hands were still shaking when I set my suitcase down in the hallway. Not from the flight. I've flown enough times in my life that turbulence doesn't bother me anymore. No, my hands were shaking because of what my son had just whispered to me in the driveway, 30 seconds after I stepped out of the car he'd sent to pick me up. He'd leaned in close, like he was telling me a secret, like we were children again and he didn't want his father to hear. And he said, quietly, almost gently, "Mom, just for this week, can you tell people you're my old college professor? Just if anyone asks." I stood there on the sidewalk in front of the house I had helped him buy, with my carry-on bag at my feet and my birthday gift for his daughter still wrapped in my tote, and I looked at my son, my Daniel, my boy I had raised on a teacher's salary after his father left, my boy I had driven to every soccer practice and stayed up with through every fever. And I said nothing. I just picked up my bag and walked inside. I should tell you how I got there. 14 months before that morning, my son called me on a Sunday afternoon. He and his wife, Natalie, had found the house of their dreams. 4 bedrooms, a yard big enough for their daughter, Sophie, to run around in, a neighborhood with good schools. The only problem was the down payment. They were short, not a little short by $180,000. I had that money. I had spent 31 years teaching high school English, living carefully, never taking vacations I couldn't afford, driving the same car until it stopped making economic sense. When I retired 2 years ago, I had a modest pension, a paid-off condo, and savings that I had never really decided what to do with. I had always imagined, vaguely, that it would go to my son someday. I just hadn't pictured it happening quite like this. But I said yes. Of course I said yes. I wired the money the following Tuesday. I didn't ask for anything in writing. He was my son. You don't hand your child a contract. What I did ask for was simple. I asked if I could come visit once they were settled in. See the house, see Sophie, maybe stay for a week and help Natalie with whatever she needed while they got organized. My son said absolutely. He said Sophie had been asking about me. He said they'd love to have me. That was 14 months ago. Getting an actual date out of them had taken almost everything I had. Every time I brought it up, there was a reason. They were still unpacking. Then Natalie's parents were visiting. Then my son had a work trip. Then the timing just wasn't right. I stopped bringing it up for a while, and when I started again, I was more careful about how I asked. Lighter, less frequent, trying not to seem like I was pushing. Finally, in March, my son called and said they were ready. He sounded warm on the phone. He said Sophie had made a drawing for me and taped it to the refrigerator so she wouldn't forget to give it to me. He said the guest room was all set up. I bought my plane ticket that same evening. The flight was fine. The car he'd arranged to pick me up was a nice sedan and the driver was friendly. I watched the neighborhood come into view. Quiet streets, mature trees, exactly the kind of place I had imagined when he described it. And then the house itself. White siding, black shutters, a wide front porch with 2 rocking chairs on it. It was a beautiful house. It was exactly what he'd told me it was. And for a moment, standing in that driveway, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Pride. Pride that I had been able to give my son this. And then he leaned in and asked me to pretend I was his college professor. I didn't ask why. I know now that I should have. But in that moment, I was so disoriented, so completely unprepared for those words to come out of his mouth, that I simply didn't have a response. I picked up my bag. I went inside. The inside of the house was beautiful, too. Natalie had good taste. Everything was carefully chosen, coordinated, the kind of home that looked like it belonged in a magazine. She greeted me in the entryway with a smile that was pleasant and somewhat distant, the way you smile at someone you've been told to be nice to. She said it was good to see me. She showed me to the guest room. Sophie was at a friend's house and would be back before dinner. I washed my face and sat on the edge of the guest bed and tried to understand what was happening. I turned it over in my mind for a long time. The only explanation I could construct was Natalie's family. They were wealthy. Her father was a partner at a law firm. Her mother sat on several nonprofit boards. They lived in a large house in a suburb I had driven through once and felt immediately that I didn't belong in. I had met them twice. Both times they had been polite in the way that made you aware you were being tolerated. I had the impression, though no one had said it directly, that they found my son somewhat beneath their daughter. And I suspected, on sitting there on that guest bed, in the house I had bought, that my son had told them he and Natalie had saved the down payment themselves. I suspected that the $180,000 I had wired from my teacher's savings was a secret from Natalie's family, and that my presence in that house, as his mother, was a problem for the story he had told them. I want to be honest about what I felt. I felt humiliated. I felt a specific kind of grief that I don't have a clean word for. The grief of realizing that someone you love completely has made you into something they're ashamed of. I also felt, underneath all of that, a cold and quiet clarity. I knew what was in the folder in my filing cabinet at home. I knew what my name was on. I decided to stay the week. That first evening was the hardest. Natalie's parents came for dinner. Apparently they lived only 20 minutes away, a detail my son had not mentioned. And I was introduced as Dr. Margaret, his favorite professor from college, the one who had stayed in touch. I smiled. I shook hands. I told them I had taught English literature and that their son-in-law had been one of the best students I'd ever had. I watched my son's face while I said it. He looked relieved. That relief was the thing I kept coming back to, later, when I was trying to sleep. Not guilt, not conflict. Relief. Natalie's father talked about real estate for most of dinner. He was the kind of man who assumed his opinions were interesting. He talked about property values in the area, about how smart the young couple had been to buy when they did, about how Natalie's family had helped them find the neighborhood. I cut my chicken into small pieces and listened and said very little. Sophie, though. Sophie was the thing that made it bearable. She was 7 years old, and she had her father's eyes, and she was completely unimpressed by me as a college professor and completely delighted by me as her grandmother. She kept slipping off her chair to come whisper things to me. She told me her hamster's name was Crouton. She told me that her dad had made her clean her room twice because the first time wasn't good enough. She pressed her small, warm head against my arm, and I put my hand in her hair, and I thought, I am here. Whatever else this is, I am here. After dinner, Natalie's parents stayed for another 2 hours. When they finally left, my son looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you, Mom. That went really well." Like I had done him a favor. I went to bed without responding. The next 3 days followed a pattern I hadn't anticipated. My son and Natalie both worked from home in the mornings. In the afternoons, they had plans. Lunch with Natalie's mother on Tuesday, a neighborhood couple's dinner on Wednesday that I was not included in, a school event for Sophie on Thursday that they attended as a family while I sat in the guest room and read the novel I had brought on the plane. I was not invited to any of these things. No one explained why. I was simply not mentioned when the plans were discussed in the mornings. I would come downstairs to find them getting ready to leave, and there would be a brief, slightly awkward pause, and then Natalie would say something like, "There's plenty of food in the fridge," and they would go. I spent those afternoons getting to know the house. I'm not sure what else to call it. I walked through the rooms when no one was home. I looked at the backyard Sophie was supposed to have space to run around in. I looked at the kitchen Natalie had furnished beautifully. I looked at the built-in bookshelves in the living room that were filled with books arranged by color rather than by title, because they were meant to look like a design element rather than a library. I thought about the year I had spent saving the money I wired them. I had stopped replacing things I didn't absolutely need to replace. I had driven my old car for an extra 18 months. I had told myself it was worth it. On Thursday evening, after they came home from Sophie's school event, my son sat down next to me on the couch. He seemed in a good mood. He told me about a funny thing Sophie had done during the performance. He was relaxed, the way he got when things were going well for him. And then, without any particular transition, he said, "You know, Natalie and I have been thinking, now that we're settled in, we'd really like this to feel like our place, our own family space. I think it would be good if visits were a little more scheduled, so everyone has time to prepare." I looked at him. "I'm not saying don't come," he said quickly. "I just mean for the future. It would probably work better if you gave us more lead time." I had given them 14 months of lead time. I had waited for an invitation that took over a year to arrive. I did not say this. What I said was, "I understand." He looked relieved again, that same expression. I went upstairs and I called my attorney. "I want to explain something about the house." When I wired the $180,000, I had not done it carelessly. I had done it through an attorney because a friend of mine, a retired banker, had strongly advised me to. The money had been structured as a partial ownership stake, not a loan, but an actual recorded interest in the property. My name was on the deed, not for the whole house, but for a meaningful portion of it. I had agreed, in writing, that I would not exercise that interest without discussion, and that my son and Natalie would have the right to buy me out at a fair market valuation if they chose to. I had told my son this when we set it up. I had walked him through the paperwork. He had signed it. And then, I suspected, he had set it aside in his mind the way people set aside the terms of things they don't believe will ever matter. My attorney confirmed on Thursday evening that everything was exactly as I remembered. My interest was recorded. My rights were clear. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was angry, though I was. I didn't sleep because I was grieving something. I was grieving the version of my son that I had believed in, the one who had good values because I had tried so hard to give them to him, the one who would not look at his mother and see a problem to be managed. Friday morning I came downstairs early. My son was already in the kitchen making coffee. It was quiet. Sophie was still asleep. Natalie was still upstairs. I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, "I need to talk to you about something." He turned around. He could hear something in my voice. He sat down across from me. I told him I had been thinking about my investment in the house. I told him I had spoken with my attorney. I told him I wasn't angry, and that was true, or at least it was true enough. I was past anger by then, into something quieter. I told him that I had come here to visit my son and my granddaughter, and that I had spent the week being introduced to someone else and left at home, while my family went out without me, and that I needed him to understand something clearly. I was not a problem. I was his mother, and I had been more than patient. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at his coffee cup. Then he looked up at me, and I could see, I don't know how to describe it exactly, I could see him calculating, working through what this meant, what I could do, what he would have to do. I let him calculate. Finally he said, "Mom, I didn't mean for it to feel like that." I said, "I know." He said, "Natalie's family, they have certain expectations. I've been trying to manage things. It's been complicated." I said, "I know it's been complicated, and I know you've been trying to protect something, but you made me invisible in your home. You asked me to pretend I wasn't your mother, and I need you to understand that I'm not going to do that again." He nodded. He looked like a person who had just realized the ground under him was less solid than he'd thought. I stayed one more night because my flight was the next morning and I didn't want to leave Sophie without a proper goodbye. That evening, something shifted. My son told Natalie they needed to talk, and they disappeared into their bedroom for an hour. When they came out, Natalie was quiet in a way that was different from her usual distance. She came and sat near me while Sophie showed me a project she'd been working on, a little book she'd made at school with drawings and sentences on each page. Natalie didn't apologize, but she sat there. It was something. Before bed, Sophie climbed into my lap, which she was really too big to do, but did anyway, and she asked if I was going to come back soon. I told her I was. I told her that I lived far away, but that I was always her grandmother no matter how far, and that grandmothers had a way of showing up when it mattered. She seemed satisfied with that. She kissed my cheek and went to brush her teeth. I flew home the next morning. My son drove me to the airport. We didn't talk much in the car. When he pulled up to the departures terminal and I got out, he said, "Mom, I'm going to do better." And I looked at him. My son, who I had loved since before he had a face, who I had sacrificed for without keeping score, who had asked me to be someone else in the driveway of a house my savings had built. And I said, "I know you will. I don't know yet if that's true, but I said it because I needed to believe it was possible, and because the alternative was something I wasn't willing to carry home with me on that plane. 3 weeks after I got back, my son called to tell me that he had told Natalie's parents the truth, that the down payment had come from me. He said Natalie's father had been surprised, and that there had been some tension, but that it was done now and it was the right thing. He didn't say Natalie had told him to do it. He didn't say he'd been forced to. He said he had decided. I thanked him. I didn't make it a bigger moment than it was. But that evening, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea and I thought about what it had taken to get here. The money, the year of waiting, the week of being invisible, the quiet conversation in the kitchen, the long flight home. There's a photograph on my refrigerator now. Sophie drew it, the one she'd made before I came to visit. A drawing of a house with 4 windows and a sun and 2 people in front of it, a small girl and a tall woman with gray hair. Sophie had written underneath in her careful 7-year-old letters, me and Grandma. She hadn't drawn her parents in the picture. Children have a way of knowing what's important. I look at that drawing some mornings when I'm making coffee, and I think about the fact that I have my name on a piece of paper in a courthouse somewhere. A piece of paper that says I am a real and legal part of that house. Not because I need it, not because I plan to use it, but because someone thought to do it right in the first place. Because being a mother is not the same thing as being someone who disappears quietly when asked. My name is on that deed, and I flew across the country to make sure my grandson knew it too. Not the deed, but the other thing, the thing you can't file in a courthouse, that grandmothers don't whisper.